Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Robert George, McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions. It's my pleasure to welcome you today for this afternoon's lecture. The James Madison Program is dedicated to exploring enduring questions of American constitutional law and Western political thought. For those who are with us for the first time, I'd like to say that everything we do is announced on our website at jmp.princeton.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter at Madison Program. On our website, you can sign up for our newsletter, subscribe to our wonderful Madison's Notes podcast, and learn more about our upcoming events, both those that we're holding virtually and the many that we're back now to holding in person. What a delight it is, certainly for me personally, to welcome our guest lecturer for today, Jed Atkins. Professor Atkins is E. Blake Byrne Associate Professor of Classical Studies and Associate Professor of Philosophy and Political Science at Duke University. He directs the Transformative Ideas program as well as the Civil Discourse program at Duke and chairs the Department of Classical Studies. A scholar of Greek, Roman, and early Christian moral and political philosophy, Professor Atkins has published 3 books with Cambridge University Press: Cicero, On Politics and the Limits of Reason, Roman Political Thought, and the Cambridge Companion to Cicero's Philosophy. His 4th book, which will be entitled The Christian Origins of Tolerance, is forthcoming from the other team, the Oxford University Press. And this afternoon's lecture is on that theme, Liberalism and the Christian Origins of Tolerance. Please join me in welcoming Jed Atkins.
Well, thank you, Robbie, for that kind introduction. And I am going to be giving you a preview of the book, a big picture preview of the claims of the book and the importance of the book. And it gives me great pleasure to be able to do this here at Princeton because I first started working on this book during a sabbatical here at Princeton in 2019 and 2020 with the James Madison Program. And so very thankful to Robbie George and Brad Wilson and others for their hospitality. Also very thankful to Melissa Lane, who kindly took time out during a challenging time for herself to organize a wonderful intellectual group for me to think through the themes of this book, which have paid dividends over the years in such very rich ways. So it's a pleasure to be back, and interestingly enough, kind of a bookend of this talk, because I have the book is copy editing and has been line edited, and I got to sit down over the weekend here in New Jersey as I flew in a little earlier and approved those final edits and wrote the acknowledgments. So this very much is a bookend to this particular project. 1689 saw the English publication of the most influential work in liberal religious tolerance, John Locke's A Letter Concerning Toleration. First written in 1689 in Latin, while Locke was in political exile in Amsterdam, the letter was translated into English and published without his knowledge the same year as his equally famous Second Treatise of Government. The letter assumes the basic framework of the Second Treatise, brought into existence by social contracts. Governments exist to secure and defend the pre-existing rights of individuals to their lives, liberties, and properties. So long as an individual's religious beliefs and practices do not harm the rights of others, the civil magistrate has no authority to limit one's religious rights. Locke held to a separation of church and state with fixed and immovable boundaries. According to Locke, religious belief cannot be coerced. Saving religion, he argues, consists in the inward persuasion of the mind, without which nothing can be acceptable to God. And such is the nature of understanding that it cannot be compelled to the belief of anything by outward force. Now, Locke's argument for toleration from the non-coercion of beliefs is arguably the most influential treatment of tolerance in the liberal tradition, but it's not the first. This honor belongs to the French philosopher Pierre Bayle, who published a philosophical commentary on these words of the gospel, Luke 14:23, compel them to come in that my house may be full. That's the entire title. A work that offers what John Kerkorian and Chandran Kukathis call the earliest and perhaps still most persuasive argument in favor of liberal tolerance. Bayle felt the existential urgency of toleration, perhaps even more profoundly than Locke. You see, Bayle was born to a Catholic minister, a Protestant minister in Catholic France, and he briefly converted to Catholicism before returning to his Protestant roots, a move that rendered him a heretic and forced him to flee France for exile in Geneva. The title of Bayle's work, published in 1686, a full 3 years before Locke's more famous letter, promises a rational rereading of a gospel passage that had become notorious in debates over religious coercion. In the 15th century, the Christian bishop, St. Augustine, had appealed to this very passage to justify the coercion of the Donatists, a descending North African Christian sect. The Donatists separated from the Catholic Church. In the most radical members, the Circum Caliones, radically opposed Rome and used violence against her supporters and Catholic priests. In a philosophical commentary, Augustine emerges as a major target of Bayle's. Bayle offers a different justification for religious tolerance than does Locke, one based on recognizing the respect for conscience and also the fallibility of religious knowledge. Human beings have the same rights and duties to follow the erring conscience as the correctly informed conscience, because there exists no definitive proofs to adjudicate which is erring and which is correctly informed in order to determine which party is in the right. There's no reason to grant authority to the rights of one conscience and not the other. Well, this alternative between Locke on one hand and Bayle on the other marks the major historical crossroads for Rainer Forst's magisterial book, Toleration and Conflict. It's a 600-page opus that tells the history of toleration in order to defend a particular version of it. Unlike most historians of tolerance, Forst locates and most historians of tolerance tend to be early modernists, Forst locates the origins of tolerance actually in Stoicism and early Christianity. The first part of his book is called More Than a Prehistory. He sees the discussion of tolerance by Augustine, in turn summing up the main early Christian arguments as anticipating John Locke's argument from the non-coercion of religious belief in the freedom of conscience. Augustine's alleged later reversal, of course, where he says compel them to come in and seems to turn away from arguments for tolerance based on non-coercion, according to Forst, previews the instability that you find in Locke for arguing for tolerance from religious coercion. Bayle, on the other hand, according to Forst, makes his greatest contribution to tolerance in a work criticizing Augustine, thereby clearing the conceptual space for what Forst believes to be a more promising normative conception of toleration for today's secular world, a concept that he tries to locate in a dynamic interplay between John Rawls, the American philosopher and political theorist, and Forst. Well, my book, The Christian Origins of Tolerance, provides a counter-history, a counter-reading of the emergence of tolerance in Christian thought in the first 5 centuries in order to recover the full ancient background against which prominent liberal architects of tolerance worked, as people like Locke, as they began to rethink the sources of tolerance and fashion it into their own theories. I argue that tolerance, tolerantia is Latin, arose from within a tradition of thinking about plurality in Roman North Africa. The concept originates in the thought of 4 influential North African Christians who flourished from the 2nd through the 4th centuries, and we have their dates and names on the board: Tertullian, Cyprian of Carthage, Lactantius, and Augustine of Hippo. Through their readings of the Christian scriptures, particularly the letters of Paul, and their engagement with the ideas of their predecessors within their own tradition, as well as with other rival traditions such as Stoicism, these Christians developed a count of tolerance in which patience within plurality presupposes political and moral judgments about the good. The central ideas of this tradition are not, as Forrest, Locke, Rawls, and some other prominent accounts of liberal tolerance suppose, freedom of conscience, religious non-coercion, although these values certainly are present, and the separation of church and state, and I'll say more about that a little later in the talk. Instead, the North African Christian tradition foregrounds the purposes and limits of political judgment and patience derived from theological reflection on God's roles as a patient father and just judge. This is the wider theoretical framework that provides meaning to the freedoms of religion and conscience. My account then places a particular political theology at the heart of thinking about tolerance. Now, the history that I'm going to tell is going to sound strange to those who believe, like Forrest does, that the historian of political thought should aim to, quote, uncover genuine progress in toleration, in which, I continue to quote, the central question is how to develop a secular moral language in which those affected can present and discuss their claims. I don't think that the history of political thought should aim chiefly at supporting those norms that we, and here that presumably is we secular liberal, those who live in secular liberal democracies, see as most relevant in our own times. Rather, in the words of Annabelle Brett, one of my teachers at Cambridge, intellectual history does not merely unravel the structure of what we have inherited, but can also unearth what we have lost. Ways of speaking and seeing the world, once current, now exotic, and perhaps full of possibility. There is historical value in paying attention to ways of seeing the world that we, again, we who live in largely secular liberal democracies, no longer perceive as current. Because by doing that, we are able to see more clearly what was gained and lost due to the choices of our predecessors. And only by more clearly weighing the consequences of the choices of those who have gone before us, can we be in a good position to think for ourselves about how to move forward with our own efforts to achieve peaceful coexistence in a polarized world. And the epilogue of my book and the conclusion of my talk, I'm going to present one such way of showing how the intellectual history that I tell may benefit normative political thinking by paying close attention to what most scholars have failed to recognize, to why most scholars have failed to recognize the existence of the North African tradition of toleration. We can take a fresh look at the pros and cons of common presuppositions of main liberal accounts of tolerance. From this vantage point, we can examine the relationship between liberalism and traditional religious theologies, particularly those of Christianity and Islam. We might more clearly see greater institutional flexibility, which may help reconcile Christianity and Islam to the liberal values of freedom of religion and to one another. So that's where we're going to go in the talk. But before we can go there, when I started writing, but even more importantly started speaking on tolerance, I began to realize that there's some presuppositions I need to address before people could engage with any history that I want to tell. And by the way, I should say as a note, I use tolerance and toleration interchangeably. Some people insist on a distinction. I don't, and I can explain why if you want in the question and answer. But I use tolerance and toleration interchangeably. But as I begin to speak on this, I would get questions. And in particular, I would get 3 questions. And the questions would go something like this, almost invariably. What does St. Augustine say about the separation of church and state? Or, is in any instance of political judgment that results in the application of authority in matters of religion an example of intolerance? Or, isn't the ancient world inherently tolerant? And so the extent to which Christianity was tolerant was simply a reflex of its time. And what Christians contributed to the world wasn't so much tolerance, but intolerance as a result of the union of monotheism and state power that happened in 380 and following when Theodosius made Nicene Christianity the state religion. Well, taken individually, these questions seem to me puzzling the consequences of sloppy intellectual history, and I used to respond to them as such. So Augustine doesn't say anything about the separation of church and state because there's no state in the ancient world. As Quentin Skinner and Dave Runciman and others have demonstrated, the state, as an abstraction that has a monopoly on violence and coercive authority, was a modern development, which itself stakes out a specific position with respect to religion, to the community, and to violence. To use the word state to translate a term like res publica or civitas in Augustine puts us within an interpretive straitjacket. So I hardly ever use the term state in my own writings for the ancient world, except when I slip up. Therefore, this is truly an unanswerable question. I can no longer answer it any more than I could if you'd asked me who St. Augustine's favorite baseball team is, which I hope would be the Philadelphia Phillies. A similar puzzlement came to my mind when questions assumed that tolerance could not follow from and presuppose an account of moral and political judgment, which the North African Christian tradition supposes. In this particular tradition that I defend, or at least expound, one cannot reasonably commit oneself to the limited judgment that tolerance presupposes until you face up to the purpose and nature of different types of judgment. Put more trenchantly, if less precisely, when faced what is wrong or unjust, people must consider the nature of judgment and their obligations to it before they can responsibly agree to judge not, to borrow terminology from the Gospel of Matthew. And if they are to endure the views or actions of others that they find wrong or unjust, they must develop the virtue that enables them to endure patiently. Tolerance, which is patience, which helps you endure the necessary pluralities that mark this world, even as it asks the tolerant to consider their obligations to justice within their communities. Now, questioners thought that this account straight out didn't make sense because talk about the political value of religious tolerance is in a completely separate world from moral and political judgments that might lead authorities to use coercion in certain matters. And so when Augustine, in his letters against the Donatists, applies his more general theory of political judgment and moral judgment to the Donatists, sometimes he argues they should be tolerated and others they should be punished, such as when they engage in violence. And most scholars dismiss this account of as incoherent without argument, and this struck me as puzzling. And in other areas, when we think about justice and judgment, instances such as war and violence or civil rights legislation, we make judgments about the good that determine if and when we should forbear. But when it comes to religious tolerance, this combination of judgment and justice and tolerance, what Michael Sandel once claimed in a book that Robbie edited, he called it judgmental tolerance, is often dismissed as incoherent from the outset, and almost always without argument. The third question that I would get is, and this is an interesting one, it's sort of an assumption, and I have it isn't the ancient world, so it's a loaded question. Tolerance is everywhere in the polytheistic pre-Christian ancient world, and polytheism is inherently tolerant. And this part is an old view that goes all the way back to Edward Gibbon and David Hume in the 18th century. And modern historians have spent a lot of time arguing against this, going all the way back to one of my mentors at Cambridge, Peter Garnsey, a classic 1984 essay trying to disabuse ancient historians about the polytheism is tolerant kind of view, but it's endured. And I'm going to give you an example from an important recent work on scholarship in antiquity. And I choose this out from Joseph Streeter because it won an award for this essay recently. That was published, I think, in 2021, 2020. And in this essay, Streeter criticizes people like Gibbon, who take passages from Tertullian and Lactantius and others from their sources. But when he himself turns, as much as he wants to criticize Gibbon, when he turns to explore toleration in the ancient world, he similarly uses an approach very much like Gibbon's, an encyclopedic approach, where he takes brief references from Aristotle and Seneca and Plutarch and different Christians from across the empire, across multiple centuries. And he says tolerance is everywhere. And he makes this claim by running through a variety of terms for, let's say, tolerant adjacent concepts in a smorgasbord of Greek and Latin texts. Even Aristotle's great-souled man is recruited as an example of, quote, how people could find tolerance or something like it praiseworthy in particular situations and exercised by certain types of men. Now, I've taught Aristotle regularly since 2006, and I have never, ever outside of arguments on tolerance, seen Aristotle's great-souled man described as an exemplification of tolerance. something must be going on here. Streeter's qualification of tolerance, or something like it, is important. He dismisses the existence of tolerance in the full sense in the ancient world, and will only go so far as to acknowledge grounds for something like religious tolerance. And so, according to Streeter, tolerance in the ancient world is everywhere and nowhere. And again, Streeter represents so much literature of tolerance in the ancient world, both in pre-Christian Greece and Rome and the Mid and East Asia. Tolerance, we find lots of tolerance, but not in a strict sense. And so this two-step move that equivocates on the meaning of tolerance is not only awkward scholarly, but its logic may lead to some conclusions that I think its proponents would not want to endorse. Tolerance in some general sense is a universal transcultural value, but in a strict sense, it's only possessed by Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment liberals. Therefore, those who do not endorse liberal tolerance are intolerant and prone to violence. And this tracks at certain points Mill's argument for empire, for instance. So as I was preparing this book for publication, speaking and thinking on this book, I came to realize that these three questions were not separate from each other, but were linked together. And what united them was not simply a set of arguments, in which case Peter Garnsey would have triumphed long ago, or Peter van Nuffhelm, who's a great Dutch classicist who has worked written very well on these issues, but rather it's a powerful narrative that has captured the modern imagination. And in the rest of this talk, what I want to do is I want to name this narrative. I want to demonstrate how it unites the above objections, and then show how recovering this North African Christian tradition can reopen previously closed possibilities for living our lives together in pluralistic societies. Okay. The account of the history of tolerance that has so captivated the modern imagination is what I'm going to call the standard liberal narrative. The standard liberal narrative about the historical origins of tolerance is perhaps most famously articulated by Force teacher John Rawls, who held that tolerance emerged alongside liberalism following the Reformation era wars of religion. Though the concept may have had its origins in religious thought as modernity progressed, it was transformed into the secular ideas of human rights and dignity. According to Rawls, tolerance, or to use his preferred term, toleration, toleration required the historical development of the idea of separation of church and state. This modern liberal development was necessary to offset the persecuting tendencies of the Christian church when linked to state power. Whereas ancient Roman polytheism offered us a tolerant civil religion, Christian monotheism, with its commitment to salvation by true belief and its emphasis on moral doctrines of right, justice, and judgment tended to lead to persecution. For Rawls, commitments to the freedom of conscience and religion, which he called in an essay published posthumously on my religion, he says represented the fixed points of my moral and political opinions, are values at the heart of toleration. Eventually, he says, they also became political elements of my view of constitutional democracy, realized in institutions by the separation of church and state. Toleration is a matter of political justice to be secured above all through liberal institutional arrangements. And for Rawls, these components of liberal toleration mutually reinforced one another. The problem of monotheistic religious violence required the separation of church and state, with the latter institution now having the sole authority to punish and protect the individual rights of conscience and the freedom of religion as a matter of political, not moral, justice. The civil rights and freedoms are assured precisely by keeping off the table moral judgments about the good, what Rawls calls comprehensive doctrines. Now, there's a few things to notice. First, the narrative that I just provided in Rawls explains all three of the intuitions behind my frequently asked questions. Tolerance was a solution to the problem of monotheistic violence. Polytheists were tolerant and so didn't have this problem. Second of all, toleration requires the separation of church and state. And third, tolerance is separate from substantive judgments about the good and have nothing to do with accounts of when to pass judgment. Second of all, it's important to point out that this account is not unique to Rawls, the historical account. Rawls himself was following standard intellectual history of his day. People like Joseph Leclerc, Toleration and a Reformation, Henry Kamen, The Rise of Toleration, and the narrative was already present in the work of his teacher, George Finger Thomas, founder of the Princeton Department of Religion. It supported various liberal accounts of tolerance, whether they are those which, like that which George Finger Thomas provided, whether they offer tolerance as supported by liberal Protestantism, or accounts like an immature Rawls, or as students Rainer Furst and Martha Nussbaum are offered on secular ground. Third, because this narrative is not unique to Rawls, it impacts many of those versions of liberal toleration that are seen as critical of or an alternative to that of Rawls or his students. Even those liberal scholars who otherwise criticize Rawlsian tolerance uncritically embrace all or even significant portions of the traditional history of tolerance's origins, people like Peter Balint and Anna Galeotti and Chandran Kukathis, for example. And then post-liberal critics, such as Patrick Deneen or Stanley Hauerwas, embrace this history only to reject tolerance and liberal tolerance wholesale. Fourth, with a few important exceptions, much of the historical work on tolerance's origins consists in moving the origins of the traditional liberal narrative back in time. We just take this framework and just change the chronology around it. Maybe it came out of medieval Christian thought, such as Carrie Naderman and John Bolin from their different perspectives have argued, or maybe as Gary Remmer has suggested, it came out of medieval Judaism or Renaissance humanism. Scholarship in the ancient world similarly has stressed the ancient origins of such ideas such as the separation of church and state, religious liberty, freedom of conscience, religious violence, and the non-coercion of the individual will. It's surely no coincidence, I will suggest, that this menu of concepts closely reflects elements within the standard liberal account of tolerance's history. So what this brief survey does that I showed you is that the historian of ideas must be concerned with more than chronology when investigating the origins of tolerance. The standard liberal history of tolerance foregrounds a specific set of concepts: religious violence, separation of church and state, the state as a guarantor of rights, of freedom and conscience, and also a non-judgmental view of toleration. As long as these ideas predominate, intellectual histories of toleration will never allow us to do anything more than, quote, merely unravel the structure of what we have inherited, to return to Annabelle Brett's indication of the possibilities of intellectual history. Well, what is at stake with the choice to read history through the lens of the standard liberal narrative or not? What's at stake, first of all, is I think it keeps us from getting the history right. You'll never recognize the North African Christian tradition if you are guided by the framework of the standard liberal narrative of tolerance. But it goes deeper than that, I think. You'll never see conceptions of other traditions of tolerance as well. For example, Islam, an oversight which has had major geopolitical ramifications. And even more importantly, the traditional liberal narrative stunts our political vocabulary. It is not helpful for tolerance to be used for any set of terms that indicate the remission of violence or force. Terms like clemency, honor, magnanimity, or friendship that's characteristic of a patient-client relationship. Attributing this to the work of tolerance keeps us from appreciating alternative political and moral vocabularies for facilitating peaceful coexistence. Tolerance does not and should not be expected to be used as a catch-all term. To do all of this work, there's other possibilities. And notice the title of my book is The Christian Origins of Tolerance, not the Christian Origins of Peaceful Coexistence. Right? The two are not synonymous, and that's one important takeaway. But the impoverishment, lastly here, for what's at stake, I think the impoverishment of our political vocabulary has led to the impoverishment of our institutional imagination. Take the Western-style separation of church and state to give one example that I will develop at the end of my talk. If Western-style separation of church and state is a requirement of toleration, whether ancient or modern, we will not be allowed to ask, are there other institutional arrangements that can promote religious tolerance and its commitments to the freedom of religion and conscience? This exclusion can also lead to unnecessary exclusions from the regimes of the tolerant, such as the case as with Hinduism, Catholicism, and Islam. I'll come back to this in the conclusion. So with that, I'm going to briefly take you through what the North African Christian tradition is, and then we'll circle back and explore the normative claims as we reread this history of liberalism with a more capacious understanding in mind. So what I try to do is I set this framework away to the side, and I take a fresh look at the origins of tolerance in North African Christianity. I argue that we should follow these Christians as they saw themselves, as thinking within a particular tradition. And here I follow Alistair MacIntyre, whose book, Whose Justice, Which Rationality, defines a tradition, in which essentially he says it's an argument extended through time, in which there's certain fundamental agreements defined and redefined in terms of two types of conflict. Those with critics and enemies external to the tradition who reject all or at least key parts of those fundamental agreements, and those internal, interpretive debates through which the meaning and rationale of the fundamental agreements come to be expressed and by whose progress a tradition is constituted. Traditions for MacIntyre are shaped by practices, that is, those activities whose goods are internal to these activities are achieved by excellences or by virtues. A tradition-based approach also excludes this encyclopedic methodology that I identified in the essay earlier, a type of methodology that, as Streeter used, aims to approach text from a detached, objective scientific approach, an approach which almost always turns out to be less objective and less detached than the scholar that's using that approach thinks. Arguments need to be reinterpreted within the context of the tradition. Otherwise, there's a strong tendency to use a supposedly value-neutral term, such as tolerance, as a catch-all for any type of socially productive concept at all, from patronage to mercy to, yes, Aristotle's great soul man. The treatments of tolerance by North African Christians, Tertullian, Cyprian, Lactantius, and Augustine clearly constitute a tradition in this sense. Internally, these thinkers engage in a productive, interpretive discussion of terms first established in the Christian scriptures, especially the writings of Paul, who reflects very deeply on when to judge and when not to, both in the church and also in Romans in the polity, as well as patience that follows from that type of exercise. Patient within plurality in this tradition requires and presupposes an account of judgment. Just as the tradition asks its followers to think of God as both a patient father and a just judge, so also judgment and patience must be combined within polities. And so the twin claims that God is a patient father and just judge directly inform the underpinnings of tolerance within a political community. The fact that God is a patient father means that he is the personal creator of all human beings. As creatures who bear the divine image, human beings are accountable to God and to one another. These dual accountabilities entail the social relationships that form human communities and communion with the divine. Accountability to other human beings give humans the right to judge one another. Accountability to God means that he has the right to judge humans, insofar as his judgments can be counted on to fulfill humanity's deepest desires to see wrongs righted and broken things restored. Insofar as God is patient, human beings enjoy divine forbearance, which refuses to render complete judgment for wrongs until the appointed time. Now, just as God's attributes as patient father and just judge mutually support one another, so do these theological ideas in this tradition impact social and political thought. The fact that human beings as image bearers are accountable to God means that their accountability to one another is not absolute. Divine accountability shapes and places limits on human accountability. The fact that God patiently withholds judgment and limits the authority of human beings to execute final judgment over human communities means that human judgments over their communities must always be interim and never absolute or final. The corollary to this truth is that human beings must wait on God for their aspirations for perfect justice to be fulfilled. And in so waiting, they must develop the virtue of patient endurance and imitation of divine patience. The preceding theological truths and social truths highlight two essential anthropological truths for understanding the political theory behind this tradition of tolerance. Both the judgment and patience and tolerance require recognition that human beings are creatures bound by both time and space. Human beings inhabit space in as much as we are social creatures with obligations towards one another. Humans are members of communities, and communities constitute spaces defined by boundaries and borders. At its broadest, human beings belong to a community that includes every other human being, since on this theology, all human beings share God as a common creator father. Within the broadest community, there's also narrower communities, the city, and associations, such as the church, which have their own identities and their own forms of judgment that are appropriate to them. Tolerance is always practiced within a human community and is shaped by the distinctive nature of that space. Narrowly defined communities, such as the church, will practice tolerance in a different manner than broader political communities, such as the republic. But all communities, except for perhaps the household, are almost always defined by the plurality of beliefs, practices, ideals, and commitments. But human beings, and this is important, are also shaped by time as well as by space. Human beings live in a time between God's original creation and final judgment, a time of growth and a time of waiting. This age is necessarily an age of plurality, characterized by diversity of religious and ethnic identities, as well as philosophical beliefs. Concern with space and time, patience and judgment, constitutes the essential preconditions for tolerance. Before you can be patient, you have to face up to whether you are responsible to judge or not. Before you can responsibly decide to judge not, you have to be assured that you are not in the place to render judgment. If you focus simply on patience and on time and ignore concerns with justice and judgment, then you may very well violate the communal obligations to your fellow human beings and to God in whose image they are made by foregoing judgment and justice and letting injustice flourish unchecked. If, on the other hand, you focus only on judgment and justice and ignore the fact that human beings are temporal creatures in time, then the judgments that you render will become overly severe and ill-fitted to their ends. The desire to turn the present space into a pure space without evil eliminates difference and leaves no room to exercise that virtue of patient endurance. Tolerance is destroyed. In short, tolerance presupposes judgment, and the type of judgment that tolerance presupposes recognizes the fact that human beings are creatures who live both in space and time. The fact that space and time must be held together means that the type of judgment in view within this tradition is both ethical and political. Unlike, for instance, Rawls's mature account of tolerance, one cannot separate political judgment and ethical conceptions of the good. Unlike the rival tradition of Stoicism, judgment of the North African Christian tradition remains political, in the sense that its decisions take a public character that impact members of a community and the common life that they share together. It's not, as the Stoics focused on with judgment, that it's a private conception of impressions made with respect to your own autonomy. So this public conception of judgment was bequeathed to later Christians in this tradition by, as I said earlier, by Paul in Romans and 1 Corinthians. So they're exegeting this earlier tradition. Now, whoops. Made me help to, thought I hit to the next, here we are. I teach a class at Duke on, it's called The Good Life, Religion, Philosophy, and Life's Ultimate Concerns. And we have like the most technical savvy room at Duke, but even still things go wrong. And it's so funny because we have like a scientific naturalist, an atheist, and then we have a Christian, and we have a Buddhist, and we have a Muslim, and a Jew. And so, it's really funny when technology goes wrong, we all like to claim, our own tradition coming to the rescue, whether it's God or whether it's fate or whether it's science, as my scientific naturalist atheist friend Alex Rosenberg. Although he's the worst at technology, so it's always science that's getting in trouble, and religion that has to bail out science in certain ways. But this tradition raises some key questions that are internal to this tradition. And these traditions, questions that are raised are as follows, that are debated and understood within the tradition, that are internal. And these are some very foundational questions that have to do with judgment and patience within the context of human community, and they are. How much should you emphasize the spatial dimension of community? versus the temporal dimension that is exemplified by the virtue of patience? Should the obligations that human beings have towards one another be understood in terms of rights or not? Where and how should you draw the limits of that individual obligations that God place on obligations to one another? Whether these obligations are to be taken in terms of your fellow citizens or in terms of the political authorities. How should divine judgment guide and limit human toleration? On what basis do human beings develop the virtue of patient endurance? What conditions and adjacent virtues support it? Is this virtue of patient endurance available to all human beings or only Christians? Is there a natural law? Well, these authors debate these questions, and they give some different answers, but complementary in dialogue with Paul and one another. And these debates constitute the internal dynamic movement of this tradition. And a lot of the book is taken up with showing how this North African Christian tradition answers these questions in dialogue with themselves and with the rival tradition of Stoicism. Now, I'm not going to have time to go through them tonight. I'll keep you from your dinner. But I think I've done enough that we are now able to step back with this tradition I've outlined and revisit early modernity. So let's do that now. And this is where we'll be for the rest of the talk. So back to Bayle and Locke, as interpreted by Forst. Bayle and Forst both misidentify the larger theoretical questions in which the North African Christian tradition embedded arguments for freedom of religion and conscience. And so they both misunderstand, misunderstand Augustine and those who came before him. And Forst, because he assimilates this early tradition with Locke, misunderstands and misses the degree to which Locke himself has transformed this tradition by placing them within a new context. And so Forst overstates the theoretical importance of Augustine's reversal of his position in his dispute with the Donatists, and he understates the difference between this earlier North African Christian tradition and Locke. He says Locke's letter on toleration rests primarily on a justification whose essentials, though now within the context of empiricist epistemology and a contractualist theory of the state, can already be found in Augustine. Though it's the Augustine before he reversed his position in his dispute with the Donatists. Now, it's true that Locke knew and even echoed the earlier theological arguments for toleration from the beliefs that God was a patient father and just judge. He does that in both the reasonableness of Christianity as well as his letter on toleration. But the force of these arguments is diminished and displaced by Locke's contractualist theory of the state, which emerges as part of a powerful new framework unknown to the ancients. Above all, Locke seeks to promote civil concord by establishing a strict division of labor between the state, whose interests are public in origin, and the church, whose interests are private, thus clearing a public space for secular concerns. Despite his many differences with Locke, Rawls too accepts separation of church and state as essential for religious toleration. He argues that separation follows from the original position in his A Theory of Justice, and he reaffirms his commitment to separation in his work, posthumously published work on My Religion. Because Forst, himself a committed Rawlsian, accepts the whole basic narrative and framework for tolerance, he neither sees nor appreciates the very different theoretical architecture that supports the account of tolerance in North African tradition, nor does he appreciate the profound significance of Locke's endorsement of an Enlightenment explanation of the origins of religious violence that bears quite a lot of affinity to that held by Gibbon and Hume. Now, why am I picking on Forst? Well, he's significant because he is representative of the great vast majority of major contemporary studies of tolerance's origins. Scholars assume that accounts of tolerance require this familiar architecture, and therefore either miss or misinterpret the rich discussion of tolerance found within the North African Christian tradition. In attention to the Lockean transformation of this earlier tradition is especially prominent in the work of political scientists such as Larry Siedentop at Oxford or Daniel Philpott at Notre Dame or Timothy Shaw, who turned to early Christian history to downplay the impact of liberal modernity on the development of the idea of religious liberty. You distort when you imply a straight line from Tertullian to something like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. For the historian of political thought, however, the study of the ancient origins of tolerance does more than help us correct our history. It also gives us an opportunity to do some weighing, to see what was gained and lost by the liberal order that resulted from the choices of Locke and his followers. Now, in my experience in talking about these matters, mainly within the university, the gains are easier to see. The Lockean liberal formation, focused on the separation of church and state, has been an important step, it's argued, in a movement that has reduced violence and contributed to peaceful coexistence in American and European societies. A stability that leads to and even perhaps depends on religious flourishing. Avoiding physical violence is a good, not to be taken for granted. I did a podcast earlier this morning on Rome, and we talked quite a lot about violence in Rome, and the world is violent, and so being able to put violence off to the side is an achievement of liberalism that should not be taken lightly or seriously, especially if we might be able to combine a commitment to peaceful coexistence with rights that come from respecting human dignity. So all of those are on the plus side that I think are important. But the losses are harder to see, no doubt because of the prevalence of the Lockean way of thinking about toleration in the West. The same framework that has kept scholars from recognizing the North African Christian tradition has made it difficult to assess the contemporary costs of liberal tolerance endorsed by Locke, Rawls, and others. In particular, the insistence that toleration requires separation has obscured the earliest theological arguments for tolerance from the world's second largest religion, Islam, with some serious repercussions, including perpetuating religious violence of the sort that Lockean liberalism has sought to diminish. If, as Lockean and important post-Lockean versions of liberalism claim, free and tolerant societies require the bipolarity of church and state, then Muslim societies must either change or be excluded from the tolerant. As Abdulaziz Sachedina notes, in Islamic theology there is in theory, no distinction between church and state. And while there is a distinction between religious and temporal authorities, including the distinct sources of jurisdiction within the Muslim polity, the Lockean divide between civil and religious interests finds no ready equivalent. Sachedina's thought is fascinating. In his book, The Islamic Roots of Democratic Pluralism, he sketches an argument for toleration that dispenses with the liberal commitment to separation and draws from within Islamic thought, depending especially on the Quran and its earliest commentators. Much as the North African Christian tradition, Sachedina's account of Islam nestles injunctions to religious freedom in an account of patience within plurality that derives from a theology that holds out that God is a just judge and patient father. Compare Lactantius Divine Institutes 5. Worship cannot be coerced. In the Quran, there is no compulsion in religion. This account only discloses itself within Islamic theology when one does not try to force one's account of the religiously tolerant society into the binary of the separation of church and state, secular and sacred, in terms established by Lockean liberalism. In Sachedina's telling, once this modern liberal binary is displaced, secularity takes on a different meaning. Much as in the thought of St. Augustine, the secular is not defined by opposition to religion, as emerged in Enlightenment liberalism, but rather the secular is the space of the horizontal interpersonal interactions between human beings in this present time before the day of judgment. Secularity is a space of judgment and justice defined by its temporal situatedness. Grasping the nature of this space is key for understanding judgment and its limitations necessary for tolerance. Such a conception of judgment, in turn, is only properly understood within this tradition, Sachedina argues, by attending first to God as Father and Creator of all, and then second, as a just judge. Sachedina's account of tolerance, of course, is simply one way among many of treating the question of peaceful coexistence within Islam. I don't have the expertise or the time to do justice to all of the rich complexity of Islamic thought, but the point in comparing Sachedina's account of tolerance with the North African Christian tradition is to give one example of the possibilities when we revisit the choices made by our liberal predecessors. The basic liberal commitment to separation has occluded both Islamic and North African Christian tolerance from view. Perhaps the promise of peaceful coexistence promised by liberalism will be renewed by the two traditions only once they revisit their own relationship independent of liberalism. Now, critics of liberalism sometimes cite the history of liberal imperialism and violence that it caused, sometimes in the name of tolerance, to such that all liberalism of all varieties is a dead end. And I think they move too fast. As I argue in my chapter on religious violence and tolerance in a polytheistic world, the first chapter I gotta clear some of that ground away. I argue that the greatest cause of violence and subjection is a radical dualism that divides the world between light and darkness, between us and them. Such dualism is not a hazard for monotheism alone, although it can be a hazard for monotheism. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks has argued convincingly that such a dualism is a phenomenon conceptually different from and distinct from religion, and which can infect religious and non-religious traditions alike. Liberal violence towards Islam, identified by scholars such as Talil Assad, Roxanne Ubin, Wendy Brown, and others, happened precisely when a particular solution to the problem of religious violence, the separation of church and state, was used as an agent of imperialism to enforce such a dualism, to the exclusion of the consideration of other alternatives. The danger, then, is in inflexible dualism that bifurcates the world into us and them, the tolerant and the violent. And Western separation, as other devices, can and has been used for these purposes. Now, sometimes liberals object, well, I get the problem, that Western-style separation does not work for Islam or Hinduism, as Jeff Spinner-Hayloft has argued. But what's the alternative? If we are going to have toleration or religious freedom for all, I can't see an alternative. It's either separation or oppression. Now, of course, the problem with identifying liberal tolerance completely with separation, and then declaring, based on the traditional liberal narrative, that this institutional arrangement is the only possibility, is this. Those that find Western-style separation incompatible with their religious tradition may very well reject this possibility. And having rejected this version of liberalism, under the impression promoted by the defenders of liberalism that this is the only game in town, feel justified in relieving themselves of the burden of producing positive arguments for their favored alternative institutional arrangements. Since a certain version of liberal tolerance has claimed the field for so long, these post-liberals mistakenly believe that having argued against this version of liberalism, they have an open field. And I think some forms of, I think of Patrick Deneen's recent book on regime change, and certain forms of Catholic integralism invite countenance this danger. As an alternative, we might consider a tolerance without strict separation. Such a tolerance and a conception of tolerance could conceivably retain its commitment to liberal values of religious freedom and freedom of conscience, which are actually pre-liberal values, since they're also supported by the North African Christians, but would be open to entertaining alternative institutional arrangements. Such a line of inquiry was recently pursued by the liberal theorist Cecile Laborde, who has attempted to conceive of a liberalism that, quote, does not mandate Western-style separation. Efforts such as hers take seriously the criticisms of historic imperialistic tendencies of some versions of liberal tolerance, while also offering new grounds on which some critics of liberal tolerance can nevertheless rightly insist on supporting the concept of tolerance once detached from Western-style secular separation between church and state. Now, to add a twist, Rawls himself, I would say, in A Theory of Justice, offers much more cogent arguments for the equal freedom of religious and conscience from the original position than he does in that same book for the institutional arrangements of the separation of church and state, an arrangement which conveniently fits with his own liberal Protestant milieu and background and historical understanding of toleration, emerging from the post-Reformation wars of religion. And in this light, it's very interesting to note that while preparing to write the Law of Peoples, Rawls made an abortive effort to articulate toleration without separation through a selective reading of Islamic scholarship, in which he took time to examine historical Islamic communities as possible models, and then he rejected that for Kazakhstan. Recent scholarship, though, has shown that Western-style separation is just one way of thinking about the interrelations between state and religion and society in tolerant democratic societies. I would highlight here the work of Alfred Steppen. Due to the development of the subfield of comparative political theory, present-day theorists have never been better in position to undertake this research in a spirit of genuine dialogue with non-religious communities, especially when considering our relationships with non-liberal polities. Such comparative work has already been begun in being used by liberal theorists to engage with the religious traditions whose theologies may appear inconsistent with liberalism. So Andrew Marsh, Islam and Liberal Citizenship in 2009, has argued from within Islamic theology as a type of argument from conjecture, to use Rawls's terminology, in which Muslims can support liberal institutions. But these types of arguments, I think, will require a much greater knowledge and appreciation of theologies of the great religious traditions that most liberal political theorists and policymakers currently possess. Kevin Vallier, in his recent critique of radical religious alternatives to liberalism, he spends a lot of time discussing Catholic integralism and movements within Sunni Islam and Chinese Confucianism, posits perhaps a liberal federalism that concedes enough political independence to liberal communities within their midst to maintain their way of life. But those are questions for political theorists. Here, too, I would say, is an opportunity for Christian and Muslim believers. As St. Augustine explained, dualism is particularly destructive of tolerance, for it erases the conditions necessary for the interim restrained and limited judgment that seeks the good of the other while leaving space for moral growth. The Donatists in North Africa threatened the difference that tolerance requires by eliminating this period of growth and change. They demanded that the present space becomes a pure space, a pure justice, where all wrongs are righted here and now. Inasmuch as North African Christianity and Islam alike have very rich notions of time, informing their understandings of secularity, which is a point in time, not so much a space within society, they have within their theologies the resources to develop accounts of the types of limited restrained judgment that tolerance within a pluralistic society requires. Now, these two traditions, Christianity and Islam, won't agree in every detail. Muslims will not accept the divinity of Jesus, who for Christians provides the model and the source of power for tolerance. But no matter. What does matter is that each tradition employs the resources necessary for tolerance from within their own tradition and recognizes that adequate resources for toleration do exist in the rival tradition. This recognition, not necessarily agreement in all the details of theology, can be the grounds for increased peaceful coexistence. Future conversation between Muslims and Christians working to develop accounts of moral and political judgment from within their own traditions may contribute to the project of peaceful political judgment and peaceful coexistence within their own traditions, whether they live within or beyond liberal polities. Well, demography is not destiny. But if we examine the global development of religion over the next 25 years, we see a striking picture and an opportunity. Globally, the number of religiously unaffiliated are likely to continue to drop as a percentage of the whole global population. At the same time, Christianity is projected to stay steady, and Islam will continue to grow and take its place alongside Christianity as the religion with the most global adherents. According to a 2015 Pew survey, quote, 4 out of every 10 Christians in the world will live in sub-Saharan Africa, many of them side by side with Muslim communities. Many sub-Saharan African Christians and Muslims support religious freedom, according to surveys, but reject the liberal separation of church and state. Large majorities of Christians and Muslims in South Africa hold traditional theologies of one God as the divine creator and judge, based on the belief in the literal truth of their scriptures. While most adherents of both faiths worry about violent extremism within their own communities, again according to Pew, substantial minorities in some of these countries believe that religious violence is sometimes justified. Christians and Muslims also know very little about one another's faith. And as a result, a significant minority, about 20% of sub-Saharan Christians, believe that Islam is a violent religion. Here then is an opportunity for Christians and Muslims to work out afresh for their own times and places the salient implications of a tolerance that combines commitments to justice as well as patience. And given these believers' current theological beliefs and their projected future growth, it's not necessarily the liberalism of modern Europe and North Africa, but rather of modern Europe and North America, but rather the theology of ancient North Africa that may best be positioned to inspire the necessary conversation to make this future a reality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jed. I actually have a question,
yes.
Really two questions myself, but as you'll recall from your year with us, our tradition in the Madison program is to first give an opportunity to students to ask questions. So if they're undergraduates, graduate students, visiting high school students, elementary school students, you're welcome to launch us. Was that a hand going up right there?
Yeah.
Yes, sir, please. Jonathan will give you the microphone.
Oh, thank you. Superb talk, by the way. And I've always been a big fan of your work.
Oh, thank you.
I was hoping you'd say a bit more about the Donatists.
Yes.
Because I imagine it was like very intellectually productive for these writers, that there was this like very intolerant movement that prided itself on its intolerance in North Africa. Like, do they explicitly define themselves against the Donatists, or is it vaguer than that?
That's great. Yeah, so the Donatists is, Princeton professor Brent Shaw had wrote like an 800-page book on the Donatists. So it's a very complicated movement whose history is complex. And we, unlike many movements, some of our best sources are from those who oppose them. So all that, I must say, as a caveat. Indeed, even their name, Donatist, was given by Catholics. So with all that as a background, I'll say a few things about them. Donatists were a group in North Africa that came in emerged in the 4th century that resisted a couple things with respect to the Catholic Church. Number one, the secession of bishops. They did not recognize as legitimate. And so they set themselves up as a church that was the illegitimate church of North Africa that had that alone sort of had the ability to baptize and administer the sacraments. Second of all, within this tradition also had several components. There were people called the Rogatists that were more sort of modern and conciliatory. And then on the other hand, there were these people called the circumcellions who were very violent and anti-Roman. And would engage in violence both towards Rome and towards those whom they saw aligned with the empire. So we have accounts, for instance, of them using lime to blind the eyes of Catholic bishops, for instance. So there was quite a lot of, so that's sort of the background here. And what's so fascinating with Augustine spent a lot of time thinking and engaging with the Donatists. And a couple of things maybe to mention. It was very intellectually productive because Augustine had worked out a very complex theory of judgment and its limits and how you deal with violence. And so he tries to apply this to the Donatists. For instance, judgment, he argues, needs to look to the good of both the perpetrator and the victim. So judgment is not simply about retribution, but also about restoration, which is one reason why Augustine came to argue against the death penalty. And so Augustine would argue that in some cases they need to be punished for violence, but in other cases there needs to be mercy. And that was in him working as a role in a bishop in late antiquity. One of the places you can do is you can be an intercessor as an advocate in courts. So that's why Augustine is so involved in thinking so deeply about these questions. Now, I'll say one more thing about the Donatists. Now, this notorious compel them to come in. What is up with that? Why this particular change? And Augustine came to learn something about belief, and he realized that belief is never exercised in a vacuum as far as individuals, but is deeply shaped by a political culture and by institutions. And what he began to see is pockets of Donatist violence were produced by communities in which you were not free to choose whether to accept Donatism or the Catholic faith. There would be fear that would be exerted that would limit what you could believe because of the fear of pressures of those without, which bound and limit the will. And so Augustine realized that while in a perfect world, you would follow the evidence wherever it could lead. The Donatists, the pressures within this community were such that was not possible. So Augustine argued that the community needed to be broken up because he argued that not only was it producing violence against Catholics, but ultimately he gave examples which could be debated, but then he gave examples actually of Donatists producing violence against themselves in the sense that some of them were actually committing suicide and dying. And so when a type of community leads to self-harm, he argues the conditions for free consideration of the arguments pro or con are not there, and so compel them to come in. So that's his basic argument, and that's the background.
Since some of our most generous supporters of the Madison program like to watch our videos, I just want to assure our donors that Professor Atkins was not criticizing people who donate. He was criticizing individuals. We love our donors. The donatists are a different thing. Other student questions? Yes, sir.
Thanks so much for your talk. Thank you so much for your talk. I have sort of a two-part question here, which was sort of inspired by your touching on the Islamic tradition. I know you said you have less facility with, but the first question I had is, at least in my knowledge of the Islamic tradition, there's sort of a difference between toleration with regards to people of your own religion and toleration with people of other religions. And so I'd just be interested to hear, what is that like in sort of the thought of North African Christians? And then the second part of that is, in my knowledge of the Islamic tradition, there's a lot of diversity here, but some of the toleration of other people with regards to sort of like patience towards the day of judgment seems to be sort of like excitedly looking forward to God, for God to punish people who disagree with you. And so I'm curious also to hear, what's the importance of like charity in sort of North African patient toleration? Or is it possible to be sort of tolerant and just like excitedly looking forward to the people you disagree with getting burned in hell?
Yes. Those are both good questions, and I think you've got the parallels good enough. Near enough that I think I can answer both of your questions. So with respect to the North African tradition, your question is there a difference between tolerance from those within the church and with those outside of the church? And this is a great question because it puts flesh on some things that I've had to talk about in theoretical terms, which had to do with different communities have different forms, and then judgment and tolerance exercises and takes different shapes within those communities. So within the church, for instance, the church is a body that is shaped by some doctrines and by beliefs that are going to make it a more particular form of community than, say, a republic, which doesn't have the particular beliefs and views, let's say, of the sacrament that a church would have. And so the types of patience that are going to be exercised within the church are going to be a little more narrower than the types of patience that would be used and exercised within tolerance. And so, so when Paul, for instance, talks about church discipline in 1 Corinthians, he's going to be much more strict about sort of the things that you can allow than in Romans when he's thinking about your relationship within the political authorities. So tolerance will take some different shapes in what you may forbear may be more broad or more narrow depending upon the type of community. Again, the judgment needs to fit the type of community for whose good you are seeking. So that's part of that first question. Now there's something else that I detect in your answer, which is, well, you can show patient endurance to those who are within the church, but what obligation do people within the church, Christians within this tradition, have to show patient endurance to those outside of the tradition? Was that also implied by that first? And there's quite a lot, actually, because patience, endurance, tolerantia, a term that was first used and coined in this sense by Tertullian, in the 2nd century and then expanded on by Cyprian, this kind of tolerance is a virtue. And as a human virtue, it's to be exercised in different situations, sure, but not just to those who are your own. You're to love and be patient not just with your enemies, not with your neighbors, but with your enemy. So an example that is often used, for instance, is Jesus' forbearance towards Judas, who betrayed him and put him to death. So if Jesus was patient and endured even Judas, whom he knew, at least in this account, Jesus had knowledge that he would be betrayed, then you can be patient towards your enemy. One of the most profound meditations on this is a sermon that St. Augustine preached to his congregation on the feast of St. Lawrence, in which some members, Catholic members, were put to death. Trampled to death by a mob, and they wanted revenge and they wanted violence. And Augustine had to argue the fact that this full, that actually here patience was required. Why? Because dealing with violence and punishing violence was something, this type of judgment was something that the civil magistrate had the authority to do. And his congregations did not. So even though the violence was bad and evil, it was not up to them to carry out the judgment and then the punishment. But they needed to forbear and let the magistrates do this. So even towards your enemies, Augustine argues, this type of patient endurance is needed, and Tertullian and Cyprian and others in this tradition follow him out there. Now, the other question you asked is a very interesting one, this sort of theological question about judgment. And you know, is there, you know, can your desire for vengeance lead you to forbearance? And within this tradition, there's kind of two answers to this question. One answer is an answer that is a little unsettling for contemporary liberals. It's the one that says, yeah, like divine punishment, knowing that someone that has deeply wronged you will be judged in the life to come, can provide an incentive to forbear. But you know, Miroslav Volf writes about this very, writes something on this in Exclusion and Embrace, and he says, well, you gotta remember, it's very easy for us, good suburban, you know, I live in a nice suburb outside of Durham, and my life is safe and it goes well, but like no one, but Volf grew up in Eastern Europe in which great violence was done to others. And when the choice is pay back or hold on to divine judgment to forbear and keep the cycle of violence going, Wolf argues, well, maybe there is something for saying, well, let God handle out this vengeance that I really want to exact because my loved ones were deeply, deeply harmed, right? So that would be one answer. And the second answer is to say that, and this has to do with a difference in judgment, that judgment isn't so much about desire for payback, but the desire for the good and restoration of the person. So it's forward-looking, and it argues that, that ultimately you hope that God will not just give them what they do, but that God will restore them and will transform them and bring them back into community. The same way that punishment on earth, you would want ultimately the person to be brought back into the earthly community, into the city, once they've served their time in prison, or in the church once if they've been excommunicated, brought into fellowship. So that would be a more reformist, sort of positive looking answer. So both of those are given within this tradition.
Yes, right down here. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. Oh.
The students are asking great questions.
Great.
I'm impressed.
Thank you so much, Professor Atkins, for being here. My name is Chloe. I'm from Cary, North Carolina, so I've been cheering for Duke my whole life. Go Blue Devils and Tigers. And this is something that you had mentioned earlier about why you drew the distinction between tolerance and toleration, and why you use them interchangeably. What difference does it make, like argumentatively, if you don't?
Yeah. Great question and perceptive. That was a little parenthetical. Very impressed. So scholars sometimes say toleration has to do with the political policy, and tolerance has to do with the virtue. And I thought about that, and what I don't like about this, and I'm the only one who doesn't like this, Teresa Bejan is a friend of mine who's also quibbled a bit with this, is that it kind of makes you think that there's a difference. There's a different, let's say, moral framework, and one is the policy and the other is the virtue, and that they're not united by some kind of coherent count of the good. And I'm not sure that I want to grant that. And when I read the ancient vocabulary of tolerantia, sometimes it's the policy and sometimes it's the virtue, and the Romans use the same word. And so again, this goes back to my whole, care of trying to use things like state or religion, because these concepts emerged in a vacuum and with people that have agendas, as we all have agendas, and I want to keep the conceptual space open. And I don't want to lock myself into a framework that has to say that the virtue is not of a piece with a moral conception of the good, a good society that connects both the institutions and the policy and the virtue. That very well could be true. So there's that's a long answer, but that's why I want to not draw a distinction between them.
Sense, Clay? Yeah, good. Well, Shane's second question walks me into mine, so I'll abuse the prerogative of the chair to ask the question. And this is about the very interesting point that you made, drawing on McIntyre,
yes.
About the way traditions as arguments extended through time are developed not only externally, but internally by internal debates. And I want to ask about that in relation to one of those four horsemen of North African Christian toleration, Cyprian of Carthage. At his time, of course, there had been the very brutal persecution of the North African Christians by Valerian. And this, many Christians apostatized. They bowed before the idols. They worshipped the idols, but under very severe pressure of very brutal persecution. So then the question became, well, when they come back, when they want to be readmitted to church, what do we do? And you got a figure like Novatus who says, well, it was really brutal persecution. You got to be understanding about this, and if they want back, let them back. And then you have a figure like a Novatian who says, well, no, wait a minute. When the time of testing came, they proved that they were of little faith. They were unwilling to pay the cost of what we would today call following Bonhoeffer, the cost of discipleship. But Cyprian takes this middle position and says, yeah, you got to let them back in, but they can't just come back. They've got to actually do public, very public repentance. So here you have an argument. It's internal to the Christian community. What do we do? How patient should we be? How understanding should we be? My sense is, and I don't know the history nearly as well as you do, Jed, but my sense is that basically it was Cyprian's position that prevailed in the end. Did that have broader ramifications for their understanding of toleration?
Yeah, that's good. No, so you've got the history exactly right. Cyprian takes this moderate position because he says, well, on one hand, you have to acknowledge that, handing over the books, the scriptures, which are the Word of God. When others didn't do that, and especially when priests do it, they have a public authority, and so the punishment, the penance needs to be public. But here's the thing: the view of this is a conception of judgment that looks towards the good and reintegration of the ones who have erred within the community. And this view did prevail. This view, for instance, bless you, Melissa, is essential to the view that St. Augustine will defend. And St. Augustine and Lactantius both, who is a 4th century Christian who impacted Augustine, both read Cyprian. Cyprian's on patience was very important for St. Augustine. And Augustine, when he explicates his account of judgment, both within the church but also within the political community, argues that one must look for the good of those both judged and those who have been wronged, and should seek that reintegration. And then once that has happened, then that's when patient endurance comes in. So very interestingly, Augustine argues there's times to judge and then there's times to tolerate. And we must do both. But the key is ultimately we want reconciliation and integration within the community, whether that's within the church or whether that's within the state. And it's very important, I think. Augustine takes Cyprian further, because Augustine says this good is really important when it comes to judgment and to punishment. In two ways. First of all, Augustine is going to distinguish between judgment and punishment. Sometimes you judge and don't punish. And that's really important, actually. Because tyranny, Augustine says at one point, echoing something Tertullian said, is actually always being under judgment. It's to be accused of something, and you think you have been acquitted of it, but it can be brought back at you. Double jeopardy, triple jeopardy. That's tyranny. And so sometimes to be judged and acquitted is important. But second of all, when you're judged, if that judgment is anchored into the good, a sense that has a sense of proportionality to it, but then once that proportionality has been exercised, a reintegration, it does mean that consequentialist accounts of judgment are off the table. So for instance, even though at some points, St. Augustine has a type of liberty such as somebody like Philip Pettit, who has an account of liberty as non-domination will have, where you want to expand freedom, where you're not under the arbitrary will of somebody else. There are cases in Phil Pettit in which it almost seems as though, and this has been a great criticism of his writings on judgment and punishment, that the goal is to expand freedom of non-domination, which actually means that might be at the expense of your own freedom. To the good of the society, because it's not anchored in an overarching account of the good. It's just in some account of the expansion of non-domination. Augustine will not allow, because it's a capacious good that looks at the good society and the good of the individual within that society, the good of the individual to get lost in some kind of consequentialist maximizing of some broader social good, such as the good of non-domination.
That's very helpful.
Yeah. So it's a great question.
Floor is open. Yes, up here.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for your presentation. When we were talking about is separation of church and state necessary for tolerance, what was popping into my mind was Scandinavia, where virtually all the countries have state churches, or until quite recently did, still impose a church tax, which you can redirect if you don't want it to go to a state church. I would also even add England and Scotland into that category. They all seem to have achieved religious freedom while still having an official religion and an official church. Mm-hmm. So can you comment on that, or?
Well, even within, I mentioned Rawls and Locke, and even within those two, they're different, right? So Locke, for instance, even though he does want to separate the religious interests from the state interests, never had a problem with the Church of England. And indeed, there's a Church of England today. My wife and I were married in the chapel of my Cambridge college, and all Cambridge colleges are Anglican. And so the ceremony I got the signature of the Queen of England, and the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Queen of England on my marriage certificate. So that's certainly true. So even within the Locke Rawls, there are some differences in how that plays out. And I would say that there's a number of different ways in which one can think about these interactions between the state and the church, and there's sort of gradations within both. But the one thing I would add to this, which is something that you might excavate from the North African tradition, but because you might, I would just say this is more than me adding this than the North African tradition. You can find it a bit in Augustine. But that is to say, too, that whenever you're thinking about different options on the table, different reforms, there also is, I think, room to think about what is the political tradition in which your country has set up. In other words, in the United States of America, we do have a political tradition in which you can have, for instance, a religious test for office. And I think as an American, I think that's fine when you think through this context within the regime in which you live. I think there's a type of maybe a assumption that's given to the time and places in which you find yourself. So I would say that what I'm asking here is for an option of institutional arrangements, or at least open ourselves to that, to think through different options, including I mentioned Chandra and Koukathis, and Koukathis, interestingly enough, has this idea of, it's called the liberal archipelago. Because one of one of the enemies kind of lurking in the background of this talk, or the bad concepts, or the concepts that at least steer us in a certain way, is a certain view of the state. And that view of the state really came into importance as something that's opposed to the church. And Koukathis says, well, what if you think about society as an archipelago? And you remove the state from the central level of authorities, but you have different societies within the federation that are free to pursue their goods that might differ from each other. And so it might be a type of federalism on steroids. So there's a number of different options that you could that could be on the table. And I would simply say that this is an invitation, I think, once we get out of the straitjacket of thinking about separation or not, that this is an invitation to explore a lot of these options.
I mean, from our point of view, in the abstract, we as Americans, in the abstract, we look at a situation like a constitutional settlement like Lebanon's when it comes to the allocation of the highest offices by religion, and we wonder, well, how does that make any sense? But you look at the history of the thing, and you look at the circumstances and the sociology, and it made perfect sense. In fact, you couldn't have built the state without that arrangement. So it's just a very different culture and history. Yes. Professor Gregory.
Thanks for the talk, and I especially appreciate my sense that there's been a long indifference by the historians of toleration to the theory, yes, and a mutual admiration society of normative people being indifferent to the messy history. So yes, I take what you're doing is, by the counter history, putting more pressure on the kind of conceptual, institutional, and legal architecture of modern liberalism that I think is there in Laborde, Valier, a number of other, not to mention Israel, India, Indonesia, like the actual lives, yes, of these, yes, societies. But you did say, and I also think you're reading Augustine as a theorist of tolerance and judgment, not just of coercion.
That's right.
But you're also saying that people have gotten Augustine wrong. But help me, because I heard a bit of what might be thought of as an enduring liberal story of the good early Augustine, who elevates the individual will, who's the separateness of persons, civic piety is not true religion, all the important stuff is beyond history, so we should really read John 8 and not condemn the woman
yes,
caught in adultery. But then he learns coercion works, right?
Yes.
If you nudge people with some tough love, you can make men moral, right? And not just moral, you can protect them in their spiritual state. And it seems like he thinks that the gospel is so luminous that even the magistrate can see this. So he writes in his letter, schism is evil. And the Donatists say, what does the emperor have to do with the church? And he says, the emperor can see the truth of the gospel.
Yes.
Right? So is there a good Augustine and bad Augustine in your story? Is there an early Augustine, late Augustine? It seems like sometimes it's the old Church of Cyprian, a little bit more like Hauerwas. We just want the purity of,
yes,
of the insider. But then he has like the expansion of Ambrose, and he sees the Catholic Church as swallowing the world. And so he justifies, interestingly, he's willing to justify it and argue about it. But at the end, it's a coercion at odds with what I suspect is your view of how we should handle such situations today. Not of pagans, not of Jews, not even of heretics, I don't think, but of schismatics. Right? It's not about beliefs, it's about their practices. So I assume you want to distance yourself from at least that North African tradition.
Yeah.
So if that's the case, don't the liberals get something right? And interestingly, O'Donnell, in his biographies, yes, I'm sure you know, blames Augustine,
yes,
for crushing the spirit of majority Christianity in Africa in ways that led to the Islamicization of North Africa.
Great. Well, there's a lot there. So here's how.
Just an Augustine question.
Just an Augustine question.
Is there an early and late Augustine?
No.
Okay.
Oh, so
There's a good Augustine and a bad Augustine.
no. Yeah, it's a good question. It deserves my answer is still no, but it deserves a more expansive answer than that. Augustine, I mean, I have a chapter on this, an earlier version of which you've read, and you asked me this version of this question.
I don't remember that.
You don't remember that? About the schism? I remember that. The schism is good. No, I'd argue there's not an early or a late, but there is an Augustine who works out a theory of judgment and punishment. He works it out and he applies it in instances of, he's trying to think about the ethics of war. When do you, when you judge in war and not, so just war theory. He thinks about it in terms of punishment. And then he also tries to think this through in matters of religion. I think generally he is consistent, but not always consistent. So I would argue that it's not an early or late Augustine, but it's, look, I mean, he's thinking and working in real time in a very messy situation. And and so I think he remarkably sort of applies his theory in these situations, but not always consistently. I think there's some limits. And I will say, and here I think John Bolin says something very helpful. John says, with this idea about justifying coercion, what's fascinating is that Augustine actually feels that he needs to do that in the first place. Because generally in ancient world, you don't need to justify coercion. And so the fact that he, at some places in his writings, and you put your handle on one, I think he stretches a bit within his own, to apply his own theory. And he stretches, I think he stretches. On the other hand, I think if you want to give him credit, it is a way that he thinks he has to look to his theory in order to justify it. He just doesn't do it and exert force or fiat there. So that's how I would generally sort of answer your question. It's not so much early, late, good or bad. And one thing that I would, I don't think this whole idea where he says, oh, now I'm going to use coercion because it works. It's more complex than that. That would put him into a consequentialist mode that I strongly would want to resist, because I think he himself resists it. It's not so much he works, but it goes to earlier on. The types of Donatist communities that they've set up are taking away the preconditions to openly consider the Catholic teachings, and he realizes that he needs to, so they're not in a neutral position, so he needs to remove that. Whereas before these communities were set up in such a way, he thought that the gospel could get a fair hearing. So it's not so much, well, coercion works, let's do it, but rather he came to appreciate the conditions in place and that were keeping the arguments from being considered fairly.
So Jed, is the answer then there's not a late and early, there's not a good and bad? There's a tension running through Augustine's thought all along.
I think there is, and I think and this is the type of argument that generally that you would want to make against views of tolerance that also are married to views of judgment. I mean, this is why Rawls wants to remove the good, because sometimes we get it wrong. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we get it wrong, and there can be bad consequences. Now, the counter argument is to that, well. But actually, when we try to take these moral views off the table, sometimes we smuggle in our own judgments anyway. So it's better to be explicit about. Yeah. So it's better to be explicit.
I know people who make that argument.
So it's good to be explicit about what you're disagreeing with, I think, here.
Timothy, you get the last question. I'm sorry to hold you. This is so fascinating. We've gone over our time. But Timothy, ask the last one.
Well, I hate to double team you with but isn't there a significant early and late dichotomy in Augustine on freedom? And doesn't this tie into tolerance directly? Meaning, de libero arbitrio, you've still got liberum arbitrium, you've lost libertas, but by the later Augustine against the Pelagians, you've lost both liberum arbitrium and libertas. Grace is irresistible. God doesn't seem to be very tolerant. God does give irresistible grace. How do you square the later Augustine, and doesn't he really sort of end, as Rist would say, with us being puppets to grace?
Short answer.
Say again?
Short answer, Jed. We're over time on the room.
No. Let me simply. I think within the most relevant part for the Donatist is, you're right. Actually, there's a change. He goes from a type of a theory of liberty that you might say is libertarian. No, well, I don't want to say that. That has different connotations. And
not the political sense.
Not in the political sense. That's in a free will sense.
Liberty
Liberty of indifference. That's more of a negative liberty. To thinking about freedom as non-domination. Where it's absent from the arbitrary interference of those outside. It's just not that you're not blocked physically from being interfered with, but also even psychologically. And I think that shift is doing quite a lot of work, because he realizes the Donatists can coerce people from considering freely arguments by putting them in a situation where arbitrary punishments can keep them from considering and being fully able not just to consider, but also to debate and argue the truth about whatever it may be. So I think that's the relevant change from two versions of freedom. The race question is complicated, and I think Robbie's given me an out to avoid getting into the complication, but I am happy to talk about that later.
Please join me in thanking Professor Atkins.